one of the things that, for me, at least this time, and I've read through the Bible numerous times. I read the Bible every day. Obviously, I study to preach. But one of the things that I have been struck most by this time is how God instituted these rules so that they could live together. He was trying to help them. All of these rules and laws that he gave them. So these are people who for 400 years have only been told what to do. Okay? They have no concept of freedom. They haven't been living free. They've been slaves. And now they're out on their own, and God's giving them some rules of how to live by. This is kind of the ebb and flow of life. This is how you treat people. This is how you care for people. This is how you discipline people. It's just been, for me, that's been the thing that stuck out the most is God wanted to help teach them how to create community, if you will. And a lot of the things that you read are just for that. And sometimes we are too spiritual for our own good. I grew up, they would say, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. And I know some people that are that way. They're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. They can't talk about anything that matters. They talk about things that just seem to be way out there. And the practical truth of the Bible is that it gives you some guidance on how you should deal with people, how you should get along, how you should help, how you should serve, how you should spend your money, how you should treat your children, how you should treat your spouse. All of those things are in the Bible. And I think they're important for us to understand, to grow by, to live by. And so that's kind of what the passage is about today. It's about how we are to treat the people who are around us, our responsibility to what the Bible would call our neighbor. So one of my favorite shows before we got Netflix and Amazon. So we pretty much stream anything we want to watch now. But before Netflix and Amazon, when you actually went to a channel, right? Doesn't that sound funny to say? My grandkids don't even know what a channel is, right? If I told them to go to X channel, they wouldn't know because everything is Amazon, Netflix, or YouTube. That's their life. And, pretty much we're going to have a generation before long that has no concept. It's like some of you are old enough to have a concept of what it's like not to have a remote control TV. Some of you are old enough to know what it's like not to have color TV. Some of you know what it's like to have 3 channels, ABC, NBC, CBS, and that was it. Some of you had that concept, and your kids, you have some folks close to you who think that's strange, Some of you try to describe to them what it was like to listen to music on an 8-track, and it goes click, every time it changes a track, and they don't have any clue, or a cassette, or even, listen, we have a generation who has no idea what a CD is at this point, okay? Just so you understand how fast things move. They have no idea. They don't write checks. Right? None of those things. And so anyway, when we had channels, one of my favorite shows to watch was Pawn Stars. That's PAWN. Just trying to help some of y'all who were like, what did he say? Yeah, PAWN, all right? I loved Pawn Stars. I liked any show that buys and sells stuff. Because I like to know the value of stuff. How does that thing cost so much? How do you determine the value of something? So I'm fascinated by any show on TV that buys and sells things. And the show Pawn Stars is based in Las Vegas at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, the Harrison family. And I've actually been in that pawn shop 4 or 5 times, just a fascinating place to go. And if you watch the show, here's what I would tell you. It's not an accurate depiction of a pawn shop, okay? The show is about buying these unusual, one-of-a-kind, antiques, extremely valuable things, and they're paying this price for it with the intent of reselling it. And pawn shops do buy things and resell it, but the average pawn shop is not getting a $90,000 piece of art or a $150,000 a car or a Babe Ruth baseball. That's not normally what a pawn shop is getting, nor is the majority of their money made from saying, okay, I'll give you this, buying it, and then turning around and reselling it, okay? So it's not a really good depiction of a pawn shop. the word pawn means to give somebody something for a loan. That's literally what pawning means, is that they're giving you a loan based on some value of the item that you give them. So the majority of the money that those pawn shops make comes from loaning people money, and they all operate almost exactly the same. And so let me tell you my experience. When I was younger, I would say I was 20 or 21 because I was living in Greenville at the time. I was still in college, and I needed money. And I don't remember what I needed money for. It apparently wasn't enough for me to think about it, to remember it, ever how many years later. So it probably wasn't that big of a deal. But at that moment, it was a crisis. And I was desperate. And so I went to the pawn shop with an item to pawn. And so what I did is I took it in. I said, I need some money. And here's what I've got. And the item, in my estimation, was probably worth $1,200, maybe $1,500. But that was about what it was worth. And the guy said, I can give you or loan you $300. If you want to pawn it, I can give you $300 for it, and we'll hold it. Now, here's the deal. He was going to give me that $300, and every 30 days, they were going to charge me 25% of what they gave me, okay? So if they gave me $300, at the end of 30 days, it would have been $75. So I had to pay $375 to get it back. At the end of 60 days, I would have paid $450 back. So in 60 days, I would have paid what amounted to $150 in interest to get my item back. And I learned a painful lesson, okay? A painful lesson, because I left it in there 60 days. He gave me the $300. I gave him $450 to get back the item that he had given me $300 for. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, have you ever done that or not? But I did. That was my experience. I learned a painful lesson. Here's the thing that I know. I'm a lesson learner, okay? I'm a lesson learner. And so I tried never to put myself in a place again that's what I had to do. But I did that day. And it was painful. It was a terrible, terrible, painful lesson. And the thing about it is, sometimes it becomes habitual because you're using $150 extra that you could have been using to get yourself ahead, and then you're behind again, and it becomes a cycle. And so the next month, if you were to ask most pawn shop owners, they would tell you the majority of their customers are repeat customers. They come back again and again and again. And sometimes it is theft and it is stolen, but they have some links to go to keep that from happening. Sometimes it is somebody that has a habit that they're trying, to feed. But often it's people who are desperate, trying to solve a problem. As a matter of fact, I would tell you that if that desperation wasn't present, pawn shops would have a hard time making a living. If people weren't that desperate, and this is not a knock on pawn shops, because secretly in my heart, I've always wanted to own one. And because I love buying and selling stuff. I mean, like I'll buy and sell anything. It don't matter, except my children, and I've considered it a couple of times. No. If you're new here, that's humor, all right? That is, I'm not serious, okay? But I just am fascinated by buying and selling, but the desperation is what allows them to make the money that they make, and they were profiting from the fact that I was in a desperate place. Well, the Bible has lots of warnings about how we're to treat one another. But one warning that follows through the entire Bible, from beginning to end, front to back, is how you treat people who are in need. The Bible says a lot about it, and it always, 100% of the time, frowns on taking advantage of people who are having a desperate situation. It always frowns on taking advantage of people who are in a desperate situation. As a matter of fact, God put lots of rules in place to keep people who were desperate from being taken advantage of. He put lots of things in place to say, you can do this, but you can't do this. And if this does happen, this is what you've got to do. And so some of that is what we're going to talk about today. We're in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 is a long chapter. It talks about some specific things. It talks about like the year of Jubilee, which I'm going to touch on briefly in the sermon. We probably should have picked this, and we probably should have picked a passage to talk just about the year of Jubilee, but I think I can give you an oversight of it today pretty quickly. It talks about the year of Jubilee. It talks about how to redeem slaves, how to redeem property that's been sold. It talks about how to redeem poor people. And so that's kind of where we're going to talk about is toward the end. We're going to talk about the redemption of the poor and enslaved. And we're going to see what it has to say about that. And I'll touch on the year of Jubilee as we go along. So first thing I want to talk about is this: support your neighbor. Neighbor is a biblical concept all through the Bible. It's not just an Old Testament thing. Sometimes, we're like, what are we supposed to take from the New Testament? Well, here's what, or from the Old Testament. And often people will say, well, if it's in the New Testament, you should take it. Well, the concept of neighbor is an Old Testament and a New Testament concept. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous stories told in all of Scripture is a story about the Good Samaritan, which Jesus told. And he says, the person in need is your neighbor. That's the whole context of the story. He says, ever who's in need is the person that is your neighbor. Sometimes we think, okay, my neighbor is the person, I live at 101 and they're 103. Jesus said, no, if the person in 203 or the person in 3 counties over is in need, that's your neighbor. The need that's in front of you is the need that you need to address. That's the neighbor that you need to pay attention to. And so the concept of neighbor is throughout all of the Bible. The concept of meeting the needs of somebody else is a concept that's in all of the Bible. So that's what this story or these laws are talking about. It says, beginning in verse 35, it says, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident and allow him to live with you. Do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Remember, do not charge interest on money you lend him or make a profit on food you sell him. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. He says, if one of your fellow Israelites, some translations will say, if your brother. So some say, if your neighbor, but this translation uses the word fellow Israelites. And that seems to be the intent, is talking about your fellow man, the people that you live in community with. If one of them falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or temporary resident and allow him to live with you. He said, if something happens. First of all, what can happen? Well, there are a lot of things that can happen. You could fall into poverty because you have bad health. Something happens to your health and you can't work or you can't physically do the things that you used to do. You can't maybe work in your field or take care of the cattle in this case. So if something happens to your health and you're not able to and it creates poverty, that could be a reason why. Divorce, particularly in our culture, because divorce is financially devastating. If you read statistics about what divorce does to your finances, it's devastating because it separates two people and usually their ability to earn goes down instead of going up because they're now divorced and they're on their own. And so it becomes a weight. So divorce could be a reason, particularly in our culture, that somebody could fall into poverty. It could be economic issues. We could go through a time when you couldn't get a job. And we've seen those times, okay? In this country where there were no jobs available and you couldn't get a job and you didn't have money and people lost their job and they lost their house and they had nowhere to go. We've seen that in just the last 15 years. You don't have to be old to go back. We talk about people from the Depression, and my grandfather was a depression. He came through the depression. So he would have been, in his teens and 20s during that time. We talk about the depression, we look back, but we don't have to go far back to see economic cycles that devastate people's lives and they don't have the ability to live. Another reason why people end up in economic distress or into poverty is stupid decisions. Right? How many of you, be honest, have ever made an economically stupid decision? That's right. And the rest of you are lying. Right? That's right. We've all made an economically stupid decision at some point in our life. Every single one of us. We've made a bad investment. We blew money we shouldn't have blown. We did something we shouldn't have done. We wasted an opportunity that we had. We've all been there. Spent way more than we should have spent. We've all made those mistakes. And the thing I know about health and divorce, for the most part, and economic situations that happen, most people are grace-filled. If your health is bad, they want to help you. They'll bring you food. We build ramps for people who can't get out of their house anymore. We go to great lengths to help people who have fallen into poverty or distress to no fault of their own. The hardest people to help are the people who have made stupid decisions and ended up there, right? We're like, they've made their bed hard, they can lay in it, right? If you hadn't have done this. And if you're a parent, you've said this, right? You saw the train coming at the end of the tunnel and they thought it was a light at the end of the tunnel and it ran them over and you like, I told you so, you should have listened, We see that happen. Here's the thing about this passage. It doesn't qualify how they got there. See, that's what we prefer. We let ourselves off the hook by saying they arrived there because if they had just, they wouldn't. That's not what this passage says. It just says if they do. If it happens. Don't try to determine how it happened. Don't try to figure out. It's not your job to be a good steward because time out. This is a pet peeve of mine when it comes to benevolence. There are a lot of people who are not benevolent that say, I'm just being a good steward. I need to be a good steward. What that means is I don't want to help anybody. Right? And we put a long list of qualifications on whether we're going to help them or not, knowing that they're not going to be able to jump through those qualifications. And so we don't help them. That's not what he says. He just says if they fall into poverty. Not if they had bad health and fall into poverty. Not if they made good decisions and the economy turned down and they fell into poverty. No, he just says if they fall into poverty. That's the qualification. If they're there, you got to do something about it. And I know this is complicated because we like to make ourselves feel better. I help them because they really needed it. But the reality is sometimes you don't know. It's about your response to God. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. He says, support, if they can't support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or temporary resident and allow him to live with you. This is the part I don't like. Right? I don't even like my kids living with me. I'm just kidding. But, I like, you got your house, right? Imagine this, that the qualification is somebody's in need. All right, you come live with me. That's response number one. Just come stay at my house. Come hang out with us. That's a challenge for most of us. And you know how I feel about this. We have created monsters in this country that we feed with money because we won't do our part. We've created parachurch organizations and government organizations and nonprofit organizations, all that we can send checks to and do fundraisers to in hopes that they'll solve the world's problems because it's much more sanitary to write a check and send money than it is to say, hey, come live with me. We're going to work through this. It is. I'm just being honest. I'm speaking for myself. It's much more sanitary to say, hey, I'll send a check to the Red Cross. I'll send a check to Samaritan's Purse. I'll send a check to pay my taxes so that they can pay, Social Security or WIC or disability. I'll send those checks, but don't ask me to be the one that's responsible for this person. here's what I'm going to tell you, and I mean this with all of my heart, and I say it. If we as the children of God met the needs we could meet that are around us, we would need zero parachurch and nonprofit organizations. We wouldn't need them. If we just met the needs of the people and the situations that we see and that we are aware about, you can't solve the world's problems if you just solve the problems that you see. It would eliminate the need for much of what we see in the world. So he says, come live with him. Then he says, do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Remember, and then he repeats it. This is how important it is. Do not charge interest on money you lend to him or make a profit on food you sell him. That's how important it was. Don't charge him interest. In our context, who pays the highest interest rates? The poor. The people who make stupid decisions. The people who are down on their luck. The people who need money to survive, not money to invest. If you need money to invest, you can get it for almost free. But if you need money to survive, we charge you the highest interest rates in this country. And it's a weight. Listen, I understand you're like, well, you don't know the risk, Pastor. I do know the risk. I understand. I know how businesses work. And the reason why the interest rates are high is because the risk of losing is more. Guess who that puts the burden on? Us. We should be taking care of those needs. We should be meeting those needs. We should be figuring out a way instead of them having to get Lord, forgive me today if I offend you, but it's okay. You'll be all right. We should be willing to help somebody instead of them getting in a cycle of a payday loan. Do you understand the person who gets a payday loan and is giving away a third of their paycheck to be able to get money in advance or whatever they're charging, 25% of their paycheck or even 10% of paycheck, usually has to do that week after week after week because they've gotten so used to getting the money in advance they can't. What would happen if you said, we're going to do a hard reset here and I'm going to help you? I'm going to give you the money for 2 weeks of expenses and you're going to take your paycheck and here's your budget. You know how painful that is to sit down with somebody and say, we're going to make a budget? You know how messy it is to have to talk to them and say, did you live by your budget? I'm not talking about you personally, because some of you figured it out. But what happened to the people that had figured it out? What if we passed that along to somebody else who was in need? He says, don't make a profit on them. He said, sell them the food, but don't make a profit on them. Give it to them at your cost. Help them. And then here's the reason why. He says, instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Show your fear of God. And then in the end, he says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. How you treat the less fortunate reflects your reverence for God. It's not about them. You see, we try to make it about them. We try to say, well, if they did what they need to do, instead of it's about us and how people view God, how we reflect God, how we revere God. He says, do it because you fear me, not because they were smart or stupid, not because of an economic downturn or economic upturn, not because there are jobs available or not jobs available. He said, you should do it because of your relationship with me, not out of your relationship with them. If you understand that your obligation is because of God and not because of the person, it'll change the way you approach things. Now, second part, don't mistreat your neighbor. It's not enough to support them. You can't take advantage of them. Because here's the struggle. Here's the rub. Sometimes we'll help people, but we expect something in return. Right? We think, okay, that you've got to pay me back, or you owe me, or I can treat you however I want to. You know, I've seen people who would generously give money, but they would treat those same people with disdain. It's not enough to give people the money. You also have to treat them differently. You can't treat them harshly. You can't pretend like they owe you something. And we're in the business of keeping score, right? Because we keep debt lists. You're like, I don't keep a debt list. Have you ever told anybody they owed you an apology? You know what you were doing? Keeping a debt list. You were becoming the banker, and they had created a debt, and you felt like the only way they could pay the debt was to say, I'm sorry. Or they said, I'm sorry, and that wasn't enough. You needed some interest, right? Right? You were going to extract it out of them. You know, you're going to hold my hand first. I'm just come to your house, right? They say I'm sorry, and you both sit there like penguins in an iceberg and waiting on the other one to touch you first. You know, like it ain't enough they said I'm sorry. Nuh-uh. They gonna make the first move. I've been there. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not even gonna pretend like I don't know what I'm talking about. You know, I'm gonna wait on them. It's their turn. But why? Because we keep debt lists. And what that does mean is we mistreat people because we expect things from them that we shouldn't be expecting. It says this: if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. So they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. We're going to stay right there. I'm not going to use the next slide. I'll just go to the end when I'm ready. But here's the thing. Be careful to say that you don't say things can't get any worse. Let me tell you my experience. Anytime I have said that, I have usually been proven wrong. I have found out that it can get worse. And so I try to refrain from saying, it can't get no worse. Because God, somebody, I don't know if it's God, the devil, I don't know, somebody has an intent on showing me it can get worse. And when you read that first part, okay, they fall into poverty, it can't get worse. How much worse could it be? It says, well, things can get worse. It says if it gets bad enough, they might try to sell themselves to you. Listen, desperate people will do desperate things. And what was an unfortunate situation, somebody fell into poverty, can become a devastating situation where they have to sell themselves. You're like, that doesn't happen. Sure it does. I've seen it. I've watched a transaction take place. I mentioned Moldova earlier. It's one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the world. Let me tell you something. Do you know who the number one consumer of Moldovan women are? No, Jewish people, the nation of Israel. Jewish men are the number one consumers, buyers of women from Moldova. Yeah, I was shocked when I found that out. Anyway, I have stood in front of a hotel at a plaza and watched a man sit at a table trying to convince a girl that he could buy her. I've seen it with my own eyes. Stood there and watched it. I've met a young lady who had been sold into slavery, thought she was taking a job, went and worked the job. Then they transferred. She went to Istanbul, Turkey from Moldova. They took her to Istanbul. She worked a job, and then they said, we're opening a second location. The job was just a way to sucker her in, and then they moved her to Russia in a factory, an abandoned factory, and it was fenced in. They had armed guards, and during the day she packaged drugs, and at night she served as a prostitute. When they got pregnant as being prostitutes, they would make them go to term with the babies. They would have the babies, and they would harvest the organs, and they would sell the organs. I've sat across the table in a pizza shop and talked to this girl, and she told me her story. I've watched it. I've seen. My first time to Moldova, I got sick to my stomach as we'd go to an orphanage where they were letting the kids out. They'd kick them out at ninth grade, and these fancy cars, BMWs, Mercedes, would pull up in front of these orphanages, and they would entice these ninth graders to come out, 14-year-old kids, to get in the car with them, and they'd offer them money. And it wasn't for a one-time visit. They were taking them never to come back again. Desperate people do desperate things. And here's what I want you to understand. That's just not happening in the country of Moldova. It happens here in this country. There are horror stories of how trafficked victims end up in a hospital or a home or in police station trying to get free because they've been sold into slavery. Desperate people do desperate things. And so somebody's bad situation can get worse. And listen, let me just stop right here. Sometimes we judge people because they've ended up in a desperate situation that we can't understand how they got there. And it's because they got in a difficult or unfortunate situation, and the only way they could see out was to do something worse. And so they started doing something that was illegal, or something that was terribly wrong, or something that was unethical, all in an effort to try to solve a problem that had been created. It is a circular problem that continues to repeat itself over and over again. And he says if it gets bad enough, they'll sell themselves. And if they do, you can't treat them like a slave. You can't mistreat them. As a matter of fact, toward the end there, he says, show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. Like you can't by force say, you've got to do this. I'm requiring you to do this. Either you're going to help me or you're not going to help me. But if you got to force me to do something in order to help me, that's transactional. It's not generosity. Y'all with me? It's fine if you want to create a transaction. But generosity says here, no strings attached. Transaction says here, you can do this, but I'm going to create a string. You got to do this in order to do it. But in the middle here, it says he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. I wish I had time to preach an entire sermon on the year of Jubilee. I think we probably will touch on it. But a year of Jubilee was basically every 50th year. So they had Sabbath years. So they worked 6 years, just like they worked 6 days and took the seventh day off. They worked 6 years and took the seventh year off. So they didn't farm the land. God would bless them enough in the 6th year that they would not have to farm the land in the 7th year. So they let the land rest. The Bible even tells us that concept about letting the land rest. And so they would let the land rest on the 7th year. A Sabbath of Sabbaths, meaning 7-year periods, would be 49 years. And there's debate about whether it was the 49th year or the 50th year. It just depends on who you read and how you interpret the wording in Scripture. But one of the two is the 49th or the 50th year was a year of Jubilee. Now, currently, we are in a Sabbath year, but September of 2021 to September of 2022 is a Sabbath year, harvest to harvest, okay? Some people would say the next year is going to be a year of Jubilee, that this year's a year of Jubilee. Some people say the year of Jubilee is still 2 more cycles down the road. I'm not here to decide that. I can tell you we are in a Sabbath year where they would have worked 6 and they're taking this year off, and that God would have blessed them enough in the 6th year that they would have enough to get them through until they started harvesting again in what would be the 8th year. That's hard to believe. That essentially they're going to live 2 full years off of what they harvest, if you understand that concept. But the year of Jubilee was a hard reset. When somebody was a slave, they became free. They got at that 50th year or that 49th year, that year of Jubilee, they got to be free. It also gave them their land back. So if somebody sold you their land, basically you were paying for the crops that you could earn on it, and you could keep the money that you had earned from the land. But on the 50th year, the land went back to that person. It was a hard reset that allowed everybody an opportunity. You knew that every 50 years, your clan, your family, your people were going to get a hard reset, and you were going to get a chance to start over. You were going to get to go back to your land. You were going to be able to work. You were going to be able to make things happen. And that's a concept that's foreign to us. As a matter of fact, it's foreign to the world now, because even the most devout Jews have pretty much stopped practicing this portion of it, where you just got your land back, because they started buying and selling and deeding land to specific people outside of clans. And then there's lots of other divisions that go on in the nation of Israel. And so they've pretty much stopped this whole concept of you get your land back. But the year of Jubilee, this is the way I think about it. How many of you remember backward masking? Anybody go to a church where they talked about backward masking when you had albums? Nobody. We had like 5 or 6. So when I was growing up, they would have these albums. You know, for you young people, an album is a piece of plastic. It's about this big around. It's black typically. Now they make them in different colors, okay? And it plays music, okay, a record player. Anyway, you would take some of these rock songs, and the Christian people would turn them backwards. And they said, see, I see some of you nodding your head now. You know what I'm talking about. They called it backward masking. And they would have these demonic messages, or they said they did. Now, here's what I want to tell you. That's a different sermon for a different church, okay? That's not what this sermon's about. I just needed to set up what I'm getting ready to say. The Rascal Flatts, okay, so y'all know most of y'all know who Rascal Flatts is. Both of those, two of the three boys are Church of God boys. So they grew up in the same tribe I did, all right? And so they have a song that they came out with a few years ago called When You Play a Country Song Backwards. How many of you know the song, okay? And so that's their play on backward masking. It's their laugh at backward masking. And so, country songs, you're talking about, my wife left me, my dog left me, I lost my truck, whatever. And the song says, what happens when you play a country song backwards? You get your wife back, you get your truck back, you get your dog back. Y'all heard that? Okay, so y'all heard that country song. All right, so every time I read the year of Jubilee in the Bible, I think of this is what you get when you play a country song backwards. You get your land back, you get your house back, you get your wife back, you get your kids back. I mean, that's essentially what happened at the year of Jubilee. It was a hard reset where they got everything back. The benefit of this was that after 50 years, there were people who were suffering because of a grandfather or a father's decision, and it gave them the chance to start over again. So a grandfather in year one may make a decision that puts the entire family in debt. And they end up having to sell their land or sell themselves to somebody else. And the children are born and grandchildren are born into that situation. And what happens is as they get older in that 50th year, it says, all right, your grandfather made a stupid decision. You're not penalized for it. You get to go back and have your land back. That's what it was. It was a hard reset, so everybody got a chance. Everybody always got a restart. You knew that at some point a restart was going to happen. And he says the people here are servants of God, and he says, show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. And I've gone over twice today, and I'll have to apologize to some other people, but it'll be all right. And last thing. We all belong to the Lord. One of the things as a pastor right now that troubles me, I don't want to say it's the number one thing, because I got a top 10 list of things that make it difficult to pastor people in general right now. But really close to the top. It could be number one. I don't know. I have to think about it. It's the loss of civility. What our country has lost is creeped into the church. And we can't associate, conversate, get along with people because they're this and we're that. And it don't matter what we are and they are. What we mean is, I'm smarter than you. I'm more spiritual than you. So when you say they're Republican or they're Democrat, you're not meaning it as a compliment. Nobody says that. It's kind of like you're just like your daddy. It's not a compliment. It's never been said in the context of a compliment. And what we mean is, I got this together and you don't. I know what I'm doing and you don't. I know what's supposed to be and you're not. And we've lost the ability to associate, communicate, conversate, have community with people who are different. I mean, if you don't have to read far in the Bible to realize there were lots of difference of opinion, thoughts, ways to do things, the ways they wanted to do things. And God said, listen, some of that stuff you need to put aside. As a matter of fact, in a few weeks, we're going to preach about a rebellion that happened. And God's like, this is stupid. This is ridiculous. We've lost the civility. And it troubles me. It troubles me as a pastor. It troubles me as a believer and a follower of Christ. And the reason why is we have to go back at some point viewing everyone as made in the image of God. God didn't just make one party in the image of God and the other party not. He didn't make just one sect of people, one color of people made in the image of God and the others not. We're all made in the image of God. And somehow we've got to get back to understanding that I'm talking to a child of God. I'm talking to a creation of God. Somehow we got to get back to, we got to stop how we're treating people, talking about people. We got to stop it. He says this, he says, suppose a foreigner or a temporary resident becomes rich while living among you. If any of your fellow Israelites fall into poverty and are forced to sell themselves, we're not in the right place, are we? Didn't I just read that? Yeah, go to the next point. You're right, verse 47, go back, I'm sorry. He says, if any of your fellow Israelites fall into poverty and are forced to sell themselves to such a foreigner or to a member of his family, they still retain the right to be bought back even after they have been purchased. They may be bought back by a brother or uncle or a cousin. In fact, anyone from the extended family may buy them back. They may also redeem themselves if they have prospered. So let me stop right here. One of my favorite books of the Bible is the book of Ruth. I'm 100% sure we're going to preach a sermon from the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth, but the book of Ruth is about this right here. Naomi was in debt. She had left her and her husband Elimelech. They came back. They needed a redeemer. And there was somebody that was closer than Boaz, and they didn't do it. And so Boaz redeemed them. That's how Boaz and Ruth got together. It wasn't because Boaz didn't redeem Ruth. Ruth did not need redeeming. She's a foreigner. It was Naomi that needed redeeming, and he redeemed Naomi, and in the context of that, got Ruth at the same time. They were set free. And so that's what this is talking about. Ruth is a contextual story for you to see how this plays out. Go on. It says, they will negotiate the price of their freedom with the person who bought them. The price will be based on the number of years from the time they were sold until the next year of Jubilee, whatever it would cost to hire a worker for that period of time. If many years still remain until the year of Jubilee, they will repay the proper proportion of what they received when they sold themselves. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they will repay a smaller amount for their redemption. The foreigner must treat them as hired workers on a yearly basis. Now let me stop right here. The year of Jubilee determined the redemption for everybody. That was the redemption price. So if you're close to the end, they're going to pay you the amount that it would have to hire a worker. If it's close to the beginning, you're going to pay the amount that it cost that person when they bought you. But the year, it was all in the context of year of Jubilee. And so this person wasn't worth more and this person wasn't worth less, at least in the context of redemption. All of it was based on what it cost to get to the year of Jubilee. And it says this, it says, you must not allow a foreigner to treat any of your fellow Israelites harshly. If any Israelites have not been bought back by the time the year of Jubilee arrives, they and their children must be set free at that time. For the people of Israel belong to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. He doesn't say that the people who sold themselves into slavery are my servants. He doesn't say the people who are in poverty are my servants. He says the people are my servants. We are all children of God. When we start treating people like we were created in the image of God, when we start treating people like we are God's people, it will change the way we interact with people. It'll change the way we talk about them. It'll change the way we approach them. It'll change the way we want to help them. And he says, you're my servants. Listen, I'm a servant of God. I was fortunate enough. I told him in the first service, I hit the jackpot lottery when I was born in the United States of America. I didn't choose to be born here. Some of you act like you chose to be born here, but you didn't. You just got lucky. You could have been born in Haiti. You could have been born in the Ukraine and be sitting on the border while the Russians are crossing. You didn't choose that. You were lucky. You got blessed. I'm just telling you what it is. It's a blessing to have been born here in this country. And if you were born in northeastern North Carolina, it's even more of a blessing. It's a blessing. Listen, we give ourselves too much credit. God said, I'm the one that brought you out of the land of Egypt. We think we did it. I arrived here because of me. Listen, everything I have, everything I get to do is because of the grace of God. Yes, I work hard. Yes, I went to school. Yes, I do the best I possibly can. But if it wasn't for the grace of God, I'd be dead. If it wasn't, listen, that's the whole concept of the Bible, is that God redeemed you and I. The whole concept of the Bible is there's a debt I couldn't pay. God stepped in through Jesus Christ, paid the debt, and suddenly I got a reset. Suddenly I got level ground that nobody else was able to get on their own. I deserve to die. Listen, you don't even have to get through Genesis to go, I should have died. I've broken just about I've touched dead people, whatever. I mean, I should have been out by now. Jesus Christ redeemed me. He gave a reset for me to be able to do this. It was God that set me free. I didn't do it. And we take way too much credit and pretend like we arrived here on our own. No, listen to me. I'm thankful and I'm blessed that I was born in the United States of America. I'm thankful that I get to do this today and not worry about somebody coming in this church and blowing it up or a missile landing on my house. I'm thankful that I get to live and work here. It is a blessing from God. And when we start looking around and treating people like we are blessed and given the grace of God and they are given the grace of God, we'll treat people completely different. We have to start treating people like they belong to the Lord. You see, how we treat people says more about our relationship with God than almost anything else. Jesus would say the same thing. He did not tell them, people will know you're my disciples if you take communion, if you come to church, if you pay your tithes, if you wear skirts, if you don't wear makeup, if you don't swim with the opposite sex. This is my list. If you didn't wear pants, if you didn't go to the movies, if you didn't drink alcohol. He didn't say none of that. None of that. He said, people will know you're my disciples because you love one another. How you treat people is the greatest evangelism tool the church has. It's the greatest gift that we can give to God is treating other people right, and other people will be drawn to him by this.